Let's talk about latency and how to fix it inside of Ableton. So there are three things that I find cause issues with latency most typically, and we'll just go ahead and run through those. The first thing that I see causing major latency is the drivers. Now, on Mac, this is not so much of an issue, but on Windows, you really want to make sure that you're using the drivers that were made by the manufacturer for your system. So this is also something that, plays into it a little bit in Mac. If the drivers for your audio interface aren't high quality, you're just going to have more latency. Right now I'm using an Evo 4, but at the studio I do have an Apollo Twin, and the Apollo Twin has much lower latency, but even here when I'm at home recording, the latency I'm getting out of the Evo is not terrible. So how can we lower this? So right now I'm at 16.9 milliseconds of latency. Now there's a few ways we can lower this. One is by raising the sample rate, and the other is by lowering the buffer size. I work at 48 all the time, no matter what I'm working on, and there's a few reasons for that, but basically, I think 48 is better than 41 just because of things like Apple Music implementing their lossless system. You do get higher quality streaming at 48 versus 441, but I don't think the benefits of raising to 88.2 or 96 are worth it. So I stick at 48, and I find that gives me a good balance. 441 is still great. Most artists honestly work at 441. So if you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. But 48 is actually going to give you a little bit lower latency, but it's going to put a little bit more processing on your computer. Again, I don't want to get too far into sample rates, but I work at 48 and I'm not changing it. So if I want to lower my latency, my only option as far as preferences go is by adjusting the buffer size. Now, as I lower this, you'll see the latency will go down. So it's already at 11.6. Now it's at 8.94. Now it's at 8.27. So there are diminishing returns there. It starts to not go down as much. I really find that 128 is that sweet spot where I'm not putting so much stress on my computer while I'm recording, but at the same time, I am getting a lower latency. So now we're at 11.6 milliseconds of latency. That is not a lot of latency. It is a little bit noticeable versus just instant, but it's not a whole lot, and it's not going to create a lot of issues when we're recording. The next thing that can introduce latency is plugins, and this absolutely destroyed me trying to figure it out when I started messing with iZotope plugins. If you use iZotope plugins, you know what I'm talking about. These plugins introduce a ton of latency. So I'll just grab one just for example. We'll use Nectar 2. As you can see, just this one plugin introduces 66.5 milliseconds of latency. So if I'm stacking that with other high latency plugins in a project that I'm mixing, next thing you know, I could be at nearly a full second of latency. And the reason for this is because of delay compensation. So Ableton compensates for the delay that the plugins are introducing, and you need this turned on because if you turn this off, your tracks are going to become misaligned. Don't really turn off delay compensation. You don't want that. But just know that some plugins are going to be introducing latency. So if you are using things like iZotope plugins, you're not going to want to use these until you're done recording. It isn't just iZotope though. I don't want to put all the blame on iZotope or anything like that. Some of my favorite plugins that I use to mix, FabFilter Pro L2, let's see, this one is 64 milliseconds of latency. So it's not just iZotope plugins that are going to be introducing latency. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because if you're anything like me, you might be using templates. I had my Pro L2 on my master chain in my template, and I didn't even think anything about it. So I was playing with a lot of latency, and I couldn't figure out why. Even in my live looping videos I just uploaded, I couldn't figure out why there was so much latency when in the preferences it says it was only like 11 milliseconds. And I would lower my sample rate trying to get it low. My fans are going crazy on my computer. And, as I practiced more, I kind of just got used to the latency. But it still did throw me off. And those weren't the best performances I could have done because of that latency. And the thing that was causing it was Pro L2 in my default set. So I took that out of my default project, and when I get to the mixing stage, I'll just put it in. It's not a huge deal. It takes, like a second to load. So it's not a huge deal, and hopefully from here on out, my live looping videos will be higher quality because of that. These are all things that will impact your audio and your MIDI latency. But there is one other thing that is crucial when you are recording audio in Ableton. If you want to have zero latency in your audio recording, you have to have the monitoring set to off. Now, what this means is you will not be able to monitor yourself inside of Ableton. If you're playing guitar, you won't be able to hear your guitar. But that being said, most audio interfaces, even this little cheap Evo 4, have a way to direct monitor. So on my Evo 4, there's just a little button I press, and then all of a sudden the knob becomes a mix knob between my direct signal, which is either guitar, mic, whatever you have plugged in, and USB audio from Ableton or Apple Music or Spotify or YouTube, whatever you've got pulled up on your computer. So getting back into the Ableton side of things, I have 2 tracks pulled up here. One is called Latency, one is called Zero Latency, one with the monitoring turned off, and the other one set to auto. We're going to record arm both of these tracks, and I'm just going to clap into the mic and show you that it records the latency. So that 11 milliseconds of latency will be recorded on our latency track. So as you can see, we have our 2 audio here, and they look pretty lined up, right? Let's zoom in. So as you can see, the one with monitoring turned off does in fact come before the one with it turned on. And that is because when you have auto or in turned on, Ableton is recording the latency that is in your preferences. So that 11 milliseconds of latency is being recorded right here. So if I zoom in here and I grab the start of this no latency one and I drag it to the start of the latency one, you can see if I dial it in somewhere around there, if I look down at the bottom, it says I've selected 11 milliseconds of range. Now this is an audible difference. You will hear the difference between these two. So just think, if you're recording a guitar and you have a click track on and you're trying to get it spot on, it's just not going to line up right if you have monitoring turned on in Ableton. And this problem only becomes tenfold when all of a sudden you introduce plugins with latency that you're monitoring through. So to show you what this looks like when you're adding plugins on your tracks and then recording, I've added Pro L2, which we know adds 64 milliseconds of latency to both tracks. And like before, one has monitoring turned on in Ableton and the other one doesn't. Let's go ahead and record that and see what it does. So as we can see, I don't even have to zoom in here. You can see the latency. It's incredible on this demo. Both tracks have the same plugin on it, but one has monitoring turned off and the other one has it on, and that's the only difference. So what if we take this plugin off, okay, and we just throw it on our master? So as you can see with this demo, the plugin doesn't even need to be directly on the track. It just needs to be in the session. So because we have it on our master channel now, it's already introducing that latency into the project, and it is going to cause latency when you have monitoring turned on. Again, plugin is not even on either of these tracks. It is on the master channel. And when monitoring is turned off, no latency. But when it's turned on, you have this incredible amount of latency. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers latency in Ableton. These same principles do apply when you're using MIDI instead of audio. And plugins are going to introduce latency, the settings, all of it is the same when you are using MIDI. The difference is that you don't really have a direct monitoring option for MIDI, which is unfortunate, but there's really no workaround for that. So my recommendation for when you're using MIDI is use plugins that don't introduce any latency. Again, when you hover over the plugin, you can see the latency. So just make sure you're using plugins that don't introduce any latency and set that buffer size as low as possible. That should be pretty good for when you're recording MIDI, and it should pretty much get rid of the issues for you. If you guys found this video helpful and you would like some more deep dive videos in Ableton, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions on this video, or if you have suggestions for future videos of things you want to learn inside of Ableton, go ahead and leave those in the comments down below. Other than that, I will catch you guys in the next one.